Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we will discuss about the Azure LogicApps, which is one of the integration services which we have provided by Microsoft Azure. As in our previous videos, we have already discussed about some of the other integration services such as Azure Functions, API Management, but we haven't got a chance to cover the LogicApps as such in our channel. So I thought let's have a discussion on uh, on the logic app side. So today we are going to discuss all about the logic apps. To start with it, we will have a theoretical discussion, and later on, as we do always, we will have some practical implementation sessions onto the logic apps. I hope you will find this useful. Let's get started. Hi everybody, my name is Rakesh Suryavanshi and you're watching Be a Learner. The very first question we have is, what is LogicApp? As I said, it is one of the integration services which we have in Azure, and it can be used to create a workflow with your application, and it can be used to integrate your application data, your application itself, or the services which you might want to integrate between the application logic, which you can do with the logic apps. So in a summary, you can use your logic apps to integrate the apps, data, and the services. Also, you can have a visual workflow defined with the help of logic apps, which you can use to send an email, read the file from SFTP, or to define any other different business process workflow within the logic app. It's very quick and easy layout which we can define within the logic app, which we'll look into the demonstration when we go into the practical session. Now let's first of all understand the concept. Let's first of all understand some of the key concept of the logic apps. So logic app has some key terminologies or concept, whatever you want to call it, which you should understand, so that in our videos, if you use those terminologies, then you should be familiar about those key terms what we are referring to. So let's understand. First of all, we have the logic app. Logic app is the services which we are going to define, or which we can define in Azure to integrate your apps, data, or the different business processes. So that's called the logic app as in term. And then within the logic app, you could have the workflow, and a logic app could have one or many workflow. So it defines the overall integration pattern, which or the process which you define within the logic apps, and that's going to be a visual representation of your business process or the flow in which your data is going to flow, right? Next, you have the trigger. So each logic app needs to have at least one trigger to start with it. Trigger is an event when the logic app is going to be started. So it could have the event based trigger. For example, a trigger could be start the logic app when the message arrived to the servicebus queue, or start the logic app when the data is inserted to a blob container, or it could be a time-based trigger, for example, or start an event or the logic app at every 15 minutes, or start a logic app at 12 o'clock in the night every day. So you can define a time-based trigger or event-based trigger, depends upon your requirement, but you need to have at least one trigger, or it needs to have maximum one trigger, and that's going to be a very first step in your workflow. So your workflow should have a very first step, rule number one, very first step as in trigger, and it cannot be more than one. Obviously it's going to be entry point, so that's why triggers are very, very important. It defines the behavior of your logic app workflow. Next, you have the actions. Actions are followed by the triggers. So actions are the basically the different processes or the steps which you will define within your logic app workflow, which defines the business process or the behavior of your logic app. For example, I could have a different actions to perform the business process. For example, as soon as let's take an example of my simplest workflow. If I process an order, then order should check the validation if it meets the order amount criteria. If it doesn't, then it requires to send an email. If it meets the order amount criteria, then it will follow the order processing system, and so on and so on. So I can define the so many actions within my logic app depending upon the business process. So it needs to have it can have a set of or the collection of actions within a workflow. Then to support these actions, LogicApp has different built-in operators which you can use. For example, operator, I could have a JSON operator or create a GUID operator, or there are a number of functions or the operators which are available which you can define to manipulate or calculate your data processing, which will go or within or which will traverse within the LogicApp workflow. So there are a number of them which you can define or use within your LogicApp, which will go into the details when we define our own workflows. Then to define or to set up the different steps or the actions, you always use some of the connectors. So the connectors are the built-in capabilities which you have within the LogicApp to connect to your application data, processes, or the different services within the LogicApp. So for example, if I would like to read all my messages from the servicebus queue, then I have a managed connector available to connect to the Azure servicebus queue and read the data from the servicebus queue. Similarly, if I would like to connect to the SFTP server, I do have the connector to connect to the SFTP server, or to send an email, I have a connector for the Office 365 which I can use to send or read the emails from the Office 365 server based on the connection provided. To create a connector, you have to define the API connections, and then you can define the different connectors based on the type of connector you are choosing. It is likely possible that the same connector you might want to use across the different LogicApp. It is also possible depending upon the tier of LogicApp which you'll use, which will go into the detail. If you are using consumption based LogicApp connector, then you possibly do not use the API connector. But if you use the standard LogicApp, then you might want to create a API connector and then use those API connector as in manage or the built-in connector. You have two different type of connectors available in the LogicApp. One is the managed connector and other one is the built-in connector. So the built-in connectors are the connector which are provided by Microsoft Azure, and if you use those connector, it is provide the ability to define the workflow actions for the highly scalable application. But at the same time, you are not charged for using those connector, or in a processing cost is not applicable. Whereas the managed connector are the connector which are being created by different teams. It can be a Microsoft Azure team or some third-party vendors who they have provided a connector to use within the LogicApp. And if you use those managed connectors, so you have to pay a minimum viable cost to use those connectors for operating your data within using those connectors, which will go into the details what those different types of connectors are available, and what are the difference and how do you use those connectors. For now, you simply for now you understand that you have the managed and built-in connector which you have to use, or you can use to set up your actions within the LogicApp workflow. At last, you have the maps which you can use. So generally in the integration application, you read the source data, you traverse or the processes the data and then send it to the destination system. And that's how the typical behavior of the integration for process is. In this integration process, it is likely possible that you might want to, let's say, map the source system data to the destination type. For example, if I have a source system data which is coming into as an XML form, I would like to perform some maps or the operation and then I would like to transform the data from the source system to the canonical system. And in that case, I might want to use some kind of a mapping strategy which I would like to follow. So that mapping strategy is been the support to that mapping strategy is available through the help of map. So you have the map which you can use within the LogicApp. We'll go into the details of the mapping section. We'll have a separate video for that which we'll be using in our upcoming videos. Now let's try and understand how the LogicApp works. So this is a simplest flow diagram which I'll be using for the demonstration of how the LogicApp processing works. So just to give an example, let's say my company has a built-in portal available to book the flights, and I have a requirement, or the company's policy has a predefined workflow which says that if an employee books a flight up to a certain cost from that particular portal, then there is a validation on the cost. Let's say if I book a flight which goes below £1,000, then the flight gets approved based on my designation and the workflow gets completed. But let's say if a flight booking amount goes beyond £1,000, then there will be an additional approval required by your management authorities. So what it does is it checks the amount of the booking. It checks the booking amount. If it is below £1,000, it books the flight right away and completes the process. But if it goes beyond the limit, then it will send the approval emails to the authorities or to the approver, and then approver checks the validation and then provide the output or provide the response. Let's say the possible responses are approve, reject, or let's say follow-up action required, for example. In such scenario, the approver would get an email with the three options, wherein the approver can basically choose the option he might want to use. For example, if approver choose the approve option, then the workflow will directly complete the and book the flight and you get the ticket. But if approver says reject, then your flight will not finally booked and you'll get a follow-up email that your flight bookings are cancelled. Or if approver decided to have a follow-up email or checking with somebody else at the let's say his own supervisor, then it is also possible that your workflow should send the email to the second level of approval for the further validation. So with this simplest workflow can be designed within the Logic app, which you can use. For example, you can have an entire workflow which can check the amount of your booking, and then you can send the email using the Office 365 connector, and then approval gets an email which he can reply to that particular email by choosing the given option. And based on the entire communication, this entire flow can be converted into Logic app. I'm sharing one of the other example which is given on the Microsoft website, where we have the workflow given, a similar workflow given for the order processing system, wherein it checks the condition of a given order. If order condition is met, which is the amount based condition, if order placed by a particular customer is meeting the amount criteria, then the order processes without having any review. But if it requires any review, it will send the email to the reviewer, and then reviewer will have three options: approve, escalate, or do nothing. So basically, based on the escalation, it will send the further email notification to the second level of approver, and then again it goes for the further processing. If it is been approved, again the order will be processed. So these are the kind of a simplest workflow which can be defined within the Logic app workflows. And if you look at carefully about this workflow, it is the simplest representation of entire process which you can visualize here at the designer level. There is no code required to set up this workflow, and anybody who even don't understand any programming language, let's say if I am from the people management side, and if I would like to follow the sequential diagram kind of thing, which is this workflow, then looking at this workflow, I can very easily understand what this particular business process is talking about, and where exactly how exactly it is defined and it is supposed to work. And when it works, actually, when this particular workflow gets executed, you will have a visual representation what all different steps are actually completed and what are the steps are actually gets failed, which gives you an idea where exactly your Logic app is flown in based on the data or the input which you have provided. We'll go into the details of the workflow, how it works, and all those things. Before that, let's have a Logic app comparison, because we know that with each Azure services you have a different tier or the different type of or the category of services available within the specific service type, as we have in the Logic app as well. Logic app is not a different in that sense. So you have a different tier of applications available service type is available within the logic app. So you have the consumption tier, we have the standard tier. So I'm just giving you a quick comparison between the consumption and standard tier. So when you set up a consumption logic app with the consumption tier, you have the ability to run your logic app based on the pay as you go model. What does it mean? That you are only going to pay for the amount of for the amount on which you are running your logic app service, as it is the same we have for the other services like app services or the Azure function capabilities. Again, with the consumption tier, if you are using, it is going to be a fully managed by the Microsoft, as it is a platform as a service. Like we have the storage account or the app service or Azure function, you don't have control on the infrastructure. It is fully managed by Microsoft, and it like hosting, managing the overall infrastructure and all, everything is managed by the Microsoft. It is a fully managed capabilities which you might want to have. It is a consumption tier is basically very preferable if you are getting started with the logic app, because it is low cost service offering, and then you are not going to charge, and you don't have to worry about the infrastructure. So it is highly recommended that if you are using the logic app for the very first time or for the learning purpose. With the caveat of logic app consumption tier has the limitation. For example, you could only have one workflow created or only one workflow allowed within the logic app if you are using a consumption tier logic apps, whereas the standard tier you could have multiple workflow created within the logic app. With the consumption tier, it is also possible that you could have a multi-tenant logic app, and these multi-tenant logic app can share the connectors or can share the data between each other from the different tenants within the logic app. When you define the consumption tier logic app, generally the data stays in the same region where the logic apps are defined. Only if you are using the consumption based logic app with the IAC, which is an integration service plan. What is an integration service plan? Just in a single word, integration service plan is basically a type of services available within this within the space of app service category, which you can utilize to restrict your app services or the logic app services or the any app services into a specific boundary of your own private network. We'll go into the details sometime later, but this staying a data in the same region is only possible with the consumption tier if you are using the IAC. If you do not use the IAC and you just use the consumption based tier, then it's not guaranteed that your data will be stay on the same region. It will be controlled by the Microsoft Azure only. Let's talk about the standard tier. So in compared to the consumption tier, standard tiers, you can define the logic app with the help of app service plan. So if you have ever used the app services like web app or Azure function, to create a web app or Azure function with the standard tier, you define the app service plan and you configured your web app or the function app within that app service plan. Similarly, logic app can be configured with the app service plan if you are defining it as a standard. With the standard logic app, only single tenants are supported, so there is no multi-tenant supports available at the moment for the standard tier. This standard tiers logic apps are generally very highly scalable options available, so it's in production. It is recommended that you should always use the standard logic app tier. In compared to the consumption tier, standard tier can have more than one workflow within the single logic app, and then this particular workflow can share the data within the same tenant within the same app service plan. For example, within the app service plan, if I define the configuration settings within the logic app, then different workflow can share the configuration settings or parameters or the maps can be shared by the different workflow within the same logic app. When you define the standard logic app and you create a workflow, you do have the option to define different types of workflow. You have this stateless type of workflow and then a stateful type of workflow which you can create within the logic app. The standard tier gives you a guarantee to stay your data or to keep your data into a same region where you have created your logic app. Let's say if I've created a logic app into a East US region or UK South region, then my data will be stayed in the same region. Only possible if I'm using the standard tier, even though if I'm not using the ISE, which we were using in the consumption tier to keep the data in the same region. So this is a quick comparison between these different type of tier. Some of these comparison or some of these configuration which we talked about on this particular table will go into the details when we discuss more about in our practical session. So this was a quick guide about the logic app in the theoretical session. In our next videos, we'll discuss more about the logic apps in detail with a practical implementation. I hope you have found this useful. If it is, please give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. See you in the next video. Thanks for watching it.